Warhammer 40,000, Imperium Nihilis, Vigilus Defiant, Part 3. The Dontoria Firewall, Legacy of Plague. Calgar demanded the matter of Dontoria be addressed as a higher priority than the Ork assaults and Genestealer cult uprisings. The Ultramarines had been critical in the war against Mortarion and his Death Guard, and he knew well that to allow the faithful of Nurgle a foothold was to see unnatural disease spread rapidly soon after. Ultimately, the barrier between reality and the warp would thin to the point that the spawn of chaos could manifest in real space. That nightmare could not be allowed to be made real. When it became known that 2 entire subspores and a city-sized spaceport had been lost to the Galapox infected, the Space Marines quickly established a quarantine zone and military cordon. The Aquilarian Council had been slow to respond to Dulanguil's missive. To them, Dontoria was of secondary importance. The Vigilus Senate instead summoned the rogue trader to hear what she had to say. Within scant minutes of her testimony, the Lords of the Senate arrived at a consensus. Chapter Master Raquilon Xantus would lead his Primaris chapter, the Necropolis Hawks, against the Galapox infected, for his companies were expert in the arts of city fighting. Meanwhile, the Crimson Fists of Brother Captain Hernandez would work with the calculating minds of the Iron Hands to effect the most rigorous cordon imaginable to contain the spread of the plague. What the Necropolis Hawks found in the decommissioned litmus stock was horrific. Peg-legged mutants with skulls distended and melded with steel lurched from alleyways and choke points. Vermin leapt from windows to stab at armored joints with proboscis and forelimb, and lumbering flesh hulks belched flame from their mouths. At close confines, the powerful claws and improvised weapons of these monsters made them lethal opponents, and many a Necropolis Hawk was laid low in ambush. But the warriors of that chapter were used to employing their guns to full effect, even when their targets were but a hand's breadth away. Their intercessors blasted their foes back in overlapping fields of bolt fire, while Hellbasters incinerated the larger mutants. With fury, discipline and self-sacrifice, they corralled the milling Galapox mutants, hunting down their leaders as the Crimson Fists drew the cordon tight. By mustering the Land Raider Redeemers of the Crimson Fist with the Hellhounds of the Vigilant Guard, and setting fire to selected sections of the Hive-Spore's Promethean pipelines, a literal firewall was established around the infected zone. Calgar and his Senate could see no other choice. Though it meant consigning hundreds of thousands of healthy citizens to a hideous death, the quarantine was established and the area brought largely under control. Yet that too was not to last, for the Scions of Nurgle are tenacious foes. Race for the Mandeville Point. Upon her return to Dontoria Highsprawl, Delaric Dulanguil met with her contacts in the Vigilant Guard. Her psycho-adjutant, the talented Morgalian, had experienced harrowing nightmares of a doom spilling out from Dontoria towards Terra itself. It came in the form of a flesh plague that turned men into cyborg demons. Dulanguil knew better than to dismiss this notion as mere imagination or paranoia, for she took her psychic's advice very seriously. Convincing her tech priest engineer contacts of the urgency of her request, the rogue trader communicated with the scribes of Neo Verum via a tight beam noospheric data tether. She requested the shipping manifests for Litmus Dock with high clearance, and in response received a message tube back. Her worst fears were confirmed. The quarantine had been breached. The export of goods from the Highsprawl had ceased as soon as the Space Marines had put their quarantine into practice. Few, if any, civilian refugees had managed to flee the area by circumventing the Adeptus Arbites' control of the planet's egress routes. Unfortunately, the blanket prohibition on space travel from the docks had been too late to stop the bulk freighter Illustrious Cargo from leaving. It had left the planet 3 days hence, after the Galapox had been detected, but before the quarantine had been put in place. If it carried infected, it was a biological time bomb. Already it was bound for the planet's Mandeville Point, that zone where a craft could slide into the warp without the gravity of either the planet or its star influencing its navigational calculations. Should the cargo safely translate into the Empyrean, it would be out of their reach forever. With interstellar communication all but impossible, the craft would likely make haste for the Daravar system unhindered. From there, it could make the journey all the way across the Nakmund Gauntlet and into the Imperium Sanctus. If there were infected mutants inside, and they carried their hideous warp affliction towards Terra, it could consign an entire swathe of space to damnation. This was a fate that Dulanguil could not allow. When she consulted with the War Council of Saints Haven, it became clear that their warships, built for raw might instead of speed, could not catch the freighter before it made warp translation. The only ship fast enough to catch the cargo was in her personal fleet, a sleek corvette she had named simply the Messenger. Unfortunately, the craft was for pleasure only, and had next to nothing in the way of guns, certainly nothing that could trouble a bulk freighter. The rogue trader did not shirk. Within the hour, the Messenger was streaking through space towards the coordinates supplied by the Neovellum Augurators. Within 60 hours, the green-grey dot of the illustrious cargo drew larger on the ship's bright triptych until its lumpen, ungainly form filled the screens. With grim efficiency, Dulanguil mustered her team, taking a handful of her finest agents with her in the craft's single transition pod, and boarding the suspect vessel. What the team found in that hellish interior will remain the burden of Dulanguil and the Lord Macragge only. Only she made it back to the surface of Vigilus, and she did not speak a word about it after her quarantine and her subsequent debrief with Calgar. What is known is that the illustrious cargo was destroyed just before it could translate into the warp, the energy signature of the explosion indicating that its engine docks had been sabotaged from the inside. Only at the conclusion of Calgar's debrief did Dontoria reveal its last awful secret. The scribes of Neovellum had dispatched a second message tube, handed over in cordial ceremony to Dulanguil and the Lord Macragge. It spoke of 3 other bulk freighters that had left the same Dontorian dock a day earlier than the illustrious cargo, but with the same shipping idents and the same destination. Dulanguil had likely saved an entire system from becoming a plague site by destroying the cargo, yet for all her efforts, for all the sacrifice of those who had fought their way to the heart of the infected craft, the Galapox infection was crossing the stars towards Terra. Hope yet. Though the Orks were running wild across much of the planet, there was one false continent where order and efficiency had managed to overcome the anarchy of the Xenos threat. Mortwald would not fall, and when reinforcements arrived, the region was able to turn its defense footing to one of aggression. Since the fall of the Otek Hollows, water was becoming ever scarcer upon Vigilus, and the convoys for its transference less and less common. With Grodolev's sub-sprawl falling to the Galapox, Dontoria was in danger of losing its own main source of water, Lake Dontor, which was now under daily vigil in case of disease. The Vigilus Senate still had not located the Death Guard forces that had brought the Galapox to the planet, and suspected that if the traitors found a way through the firewall, they would move against a lake with yet more contaminants. Water was not the only resource that was hard to come by. The fourth continent of Mortwald was the producer of most of the planet's food and medicine, but with the Ork menace threatening its outskirts, and the cult of the Pauper princes rising within its southern reaches, production was drying up, and the common people were paying the price. Some of the original members of the Aquilarian Council implied that Mortwald's rulers, the planetary governor's militant brother Dinos Agamemnus amongst them, would be content to see their own defense at the exclusion of all else. The question hung in the air. Even should Vigilus's defenders throw back the Xenos, would they starve to death in the process? Mortwald did not lack for experienced soldiery. For over the century since Dinos had taken rulership of that prefecture, it had been reinforced by regiments from the Indigan prefects, Lokuharprine sandsmen, Ventrilian nobles, Vostroyan firstborn, and lately even dispossessed Cadian shock troops. They would gladly fight against the Orks, whether the force fields were active or not. Many of them had been engaged at the Cadian Gate, a land where they defended heavily entrenched positions against a foe that would fight in a brutal but traditional fashion seemed far more straightforward than the nightmare of fighting the forces of chaos. When the Praet's Bastion force fields went down en masse, the Orks of Tanker Spill made a headlong assault against the Dainos trench network to the north of Mortwald. The Astra Militarum held fast, gunning down the Orks with heavy bolters, autocannons and lasguns as the greenskins raced across the killing grounds. Where the Orks came on in armoured hosts too numerous to stop, the Astra Militarum would fall back, concede a line or two, forcing the Xenos vehicles to flounder in the deep trenches. Slow to a crawl, they were easy prey for the las cannon beams and crack missiles of the weapon teams in the bunkers behind. Once the push was blunted, Ogrin work teams would be sent in to clear the wreckage and shore up the defences, using anything from slabs of metal to corpses. For weeks, the Orks made one push after another, even attacking through the forests of barbed wire that typified the Zella line of the south. Still, the Astra Militarum held fast, not only against the greenskins, but also the cult uprising of the ejector districts, biosanctic flesh plants and worker habs. Lord Dainos Agamemnus preached a mantra, compulsorily reinforced via the command echelons and repeated among the troops thousands of times a day. Mortworld would not fall. When the bulk landers and gunships of the Imperial reinforcements made it through the Ork blockades to New Vitae docks, the stubborn resolve of the Mortworld defenders turned to outright zeal. The sight of hundreds of Imperial fists striding to the front line in bright heraldic yellow, unafraid of any enemy weapon, put fire into the souls of all that witnessed them. Within days, Captain Fane, the laconic and battle-scarred leader of the Imperial Fist's 5th Company, had assessed the plans of the Dainos Trench Network and the Zella Line. He put into place an overlapping defensive pattern of impressive efficiency, moving his warriors to any site where the Orks attacked with heavy assets. When it came to enemy infantry and even vehicle squadrons, the captain systematically destroyed anything that dared his gun sights. Only the titanic scrap walkers that strode over the trenches towards Electros Hive had might enough to break the eastern cordon. So large and numerous were the stompers that the Imperial forces had no choice but to concede the entire district and retreat to higher ground to muster a counterattack. When the vast fat-bellied hangar ships that transported Imperial Knights lowered through the clouds at New Vitae docks, Captain Fane was amongst the delegation that greeted the occupants. The ground shook as the massive war engines strode out of their hangars to defend Mortwald. Among the adamantium lances bearing the heraldry of the Knight households came free blades from Darovar, crusading from the Rift Corridor to ensure its gatehouse did not fall. On that day, Captain Fane muttered praise to the Emperor. A charge into legend. Many of the Imperial Knights that had landed at Mortwald were keen to sally forth against the monstrous Ork walkers emerging from the scrap cities. Some put this down to youthful bravado, though as the weeks of battle slid by, Captain Fane of the Imperial Fist began to think that there was something else at play. The Knights of House Terran made haste to attack the Stompers that had invaded Mortwald, engaging them at range and methodically taking them out one by one. In contrast, the Imperial Knights that arrived from Darovar petitioned to drive their adamantium lances deep into enemy territory. They maintained that fighting the foot soldiers of the Xenos races amongst the trenches would win them little glory, for to the nobles who piloted the gigantic heraldic walkers, mere infantry posed little threat. But there was something in the Knights' insistence that they form the vanguard that raised eyebrows amongst their allies in the Imperial Fists, Fane in particular. Even for headstrong young nobles, these freeblades seemed too eager for a frontal assault. There was a shadow behind the eyes of these young warriors, and especially their leader, the red-bearded young noble Yaron Vanaklimptus, that Fane recognized. Speaking to his trusted aides in low tones, Fane revealed that he saw something of himself in that look. Since his company of Imperial Fists had concluded their war against the Mindcraw Coven of Zinch, he had been haunted by waking dreams of such potency, he sometimes wished for death just to put an end to them. Could it be that these free blades have faced a similar ordeal, but did not have the mental conditioning of the Adeptus Astartes to cope with it? Could their insistence upon recklessness be connected to the fact that they had obscured their traditional heraldic insignia and taken new identities? To Dionysos Agamemnus it was irrelevant. He saw the knights as powerful tools that could help him win his private war. Naturally, he was glad of their coming, but to him they were but cavalier pieces in a game of regicide. He issued an edict forbidding them from heading out past the trench lines and the bastion shield network and into the wastes beyond. As a powerful source of artillery that could outrange nearly all the war assets the Orks could send against them, they were too valuable to risk. Besides which, they had an obligation to the thrones of their elders and betters. For a time, the Free Blade Knights grudgingly appeared to abide by the laws. The princeps of the Reaver Titan, Heresium's Bane, a long-time ally of Daenos and his traditionalist cronies, reminded the knights of the duty they had to the people of Mortwald. He pointed out that despite the fact that his warhound Maniple, the Hyperion Hounds, wished for nothing more than to be on the hunt, they too held fast. Chastened, the knights deployed alongside Captain Fane in a series of staggering defences that saw several Ork attacks blunted and scattered to the winds. For long days, however, the Free Blades and their towering Titan allies stood motionless and silent, awaiting a foe that was slow to come. Every few days the Orks attacked Mortwald, and each time their forces were ground to a halt before being driven back in disarray. Yet the heavy assets being sent against Captain Fane and his allies were growing larger and more formidable with every passing week. The Ork war machines, far more numerous than the Imperial equivalents, were at first the size of dreadnoughts, but then swelled into fat-bellied monstrosities the size of knights, then warhounds. When lumbering machines that rivaled Heresium's Bane in size appeared on the horizon, Fane made his final decision. The Orc factories had to be shut down. He issued a series of curt orders to Vanaclyptus and his fellow knights over a closed channel, citing his authority as that of the first founding and a true son of Rogel Dawn. Within the hour they were striding across the Dionysos trench line and out into the wastelands, accompanied by the Hyperion Hounds. It was time to let slip the dogs of war. Battle of Tanker Spill. The Free Blade Knights had assaulted the Orc scrap city to the east of Mortwald. Tanker Spill approached from the Dionysos trench network under cover of the dust storm kicked up by an Orc attack wave. Waiting until the greenskins were upwind, they smashed their way eastward through the horde at full charge. Expertly plying their ion shields to deflect fire, the knights were through the foe's lines and out the other side before the Xenos realized what had hit them. The Orc horde was confounded, with half their number wishing to go back and the others not knowing why the sudden delay had occurred. Milling in disarray, they were easy prey for the Warhound Maniples and the Reaver Heresium's Bane. As twilight turned to darkness, on charged the Free Blade Knights, their attack upon the now poorly defended Tanker Spill a devastating lance to the guts of a dormant beast of war. Explosions lit the night as the Free Blades cut apart Orc factories with their melter weapons and blasted half-built stompers to scrap with their rapid-fire battle cannons. Fane, sending a Vox over a closed channel, ordered the triumphant knights to head back to Mortwald to resupply, for he could see the factory city was aflame even from the Sprawl's trenches. But the Free Blades pressed on, taking their fight to the next scrap city. There they charged headlining into the massed battle wagons and gunned up walkers that had mustered for the next assault, killing thousands of Orcs before they were surrounded. Aqua Meteoris. The sudden Xenos conquest of Megaborealis had seen much of the city erupt in fire. Resources were growing ever more precious, and none more so than the water harnessed from orbit by the Adeptus Mechanicus. The leaders of the Pauper princes knew of this weak point and exploited it mercilessly. The ongoing war for Megaborealis had seen the ordered mind of Archmagos Nessium Caldric joined by the merciless pragmatism of Fabricator Vosh and the clinical, cold-hearted logic of the Iron Hands. It had proven a potent combination. Megaborealis was largely coming back under Imperial control, district by district. The Space Marines would break the backs of each major incursion, and when the culprits went to ground, the Skitarii and their tech priest masters would exterminate that which was left over. With the auspicators and omnispexes of the Imperial Defenders keyed to Xenos biosignatures, each grid pattern hunt was methodical and effective. The cult of the Pauper Princes, having secured brief dominance over a third of the Megaboreal's sprawl, had been forced to fall back in a score of different war zones. A month after the arrival of the Iron Hands, the cultists were fighting a guerrilla war once more against the resurgent Skitarii macroclades. There was one exception, however, and it was a critical one. In the districts surrounding the Stygian spires and the greater Omnissian hoist, the icons of the Genestealer cult were still raised high. A foremost primus of the cult, Deathru Noan, had designated that region one of paramount importance. Not only was the vast megalithic hive of the spires the nexus of all Megaborealis' command structures, it was also the site where water was processed from the meteors caught in orbit and conveyed to the planet's surface via Vosh's towering counterweighted winch mechanism, the Omnissian hoist. Primus Noan was a rationalist more than a fanatic. He knew that without this source of water, and with convoys transporting emergency rations cut off by the Orks all over the planet, the Adeptus Mechanicus could be starved of the vital fluid they required. He intended to besiege the greater hive spore from its own central keep. To put his plans into motion, Noan entered the vast brood cathedrum in the lower levels of Megaborealis, passing through corpse-strung colonnades and banners propped tall against piles of captured war gear. Waiting for him in the crypt, half submerged in the semi-liquefied remains of his deceased followers, was Grandsire Worm. Strange bony growths had arisen to form a weird throne of chitin around the hulking pure strain, and familiars bubbled up from the fleshy slurry to stare at Noan with alien intensity. The Grandsire's eyes glittered malevolently as it flexed its claws, for the creature did not relish being disturbed in its biopsychic communions with the wider cult. Fortunately for him, Noan had enlisted the aid of the magus known as Slint. The Psyker made a mind link with the Grandsire and put across the battle plan on Noan's behalf. A long, tense minute stretched by before the Grandsire shifted from its pool, standing up to its full, terrifying height and barging past the petitioners. The Magos announced grandly that the assault upon the Stygian spires would be led by the Patriarch himself, then hurried from the tomb after its master. Within a single day of scuttling activity, the undersump of the Stygian spires was filled with pure-strain Genestealers. They came from all across the continent and beyond, answering the psychic call of their Patriarch without hesitation. There were no hunting howls echoing through the night, no call and response or chanting of prayers. The incoming demise of Megaborealis was silent, but moved with a singular purpose. The takeover of the Stygian spires was bloody in the extreme. First came the event that would be known in history books as the Vertical Massacre. Like many Imperial hives, the spires had underlevels so deep, dank and labyrinth that none truly knew their full extent. With the war against the Orks taking up so many resources in the city above, the Skitarii patrols that were operating down in the substrata had been drained to almost nothing. It was not only the pure strains that converged upon the Stygian spires summoned by the Patriarch's call, but every cult member in the continent. Long sealed hatches were broken open, crawl spaces unblocked, and new tunnels dug with rock grinder and macro drill. As industrious and focused as termites, the cultists burrowed their way into the lower strata of the Stygian spires, their kill teams taking down all enemy resistance at a slow but methodical pace. When the warning klaxon sounded, a full fifth of the spire's tunnels were already under cult control. The corridors of the Stygian spires resounded with a metallic crump of thousands of Skitarii feet as the garrison scrambled to intercept the invaders below. A sprawling, multi-leveled battle erupted, and the Skitarii quickly gained the upper hand. They fought with the determination of zealous men defending their temple, and their tech priest Dominus masters had put into place contingencies and battle plans for every conceivable form of invasion. With the alert protocols triggering these long-honed battle plans, the response was quick and the corridors were soon littered with the corpses of Xenos hybrids. The one flaw in the tech priest's plans was that they did not factor in the precious water pipelines. As the vanguard organisms of the Tyranid race, a quirk of Genestealer anatomy allows them to fold their gangling bodies into tight crawl spaces, holes and tubes, the better to exploit vectors of passage from one infection site to another. After Grandsire Worm's sickle-like claws ripped gaping holes in the warpter pipes that carried the Aqua Meteoris, the pure strains of the cult squeezed inside each pipe, one after another. Tirelessly, they wriggled and crawled against the high-pressure flow for a full day, a feat no man or even orc could have accomplished, until they reached the water farms at the top levels of the spires, lightly defended, with the bulk of the Skitarii engaged far below. The farms soon looked like abattoirs, strewn with torn flesh and bionic limbs. With their enemies attacking from above and below, the Skitarii were trapped, and after 3 days of fighting, overcome. A strange stampede. Vigilus's premium water supply industry was slow to a trickle when the beastmasters of the Drukhari witch cults learned how to control the snow-white ice mantises that hunted through the blizzards of Calyx's Bane. By modulating their agonizer whips and splinter ammunition to drive the giant insects into a skittering frenzy, they herded hundreds of the creatures across the glaciers and swathes of permafrost, and straight into the canyons of the Calyx macro quarries. The Drukhari took a great deal of statistic sustenance from watching the stallion-sized ice mantises scything apart Skitarii and quarrymen in a bloodbath that saw rivulets of gory slush stain the snow of each crater bright red. End quote. I have been Baldermort, your faithful servant. Now, no matter what you do today, do try to make time for fun. Toodaloo.